Everything you have been told about Megalodon is based on teeth. Just teeth. No skull, no spine, no fins, no complete skeleton of any kind. The largest predator that has ever existed on this planet left behind almost nothing except its teeth. And from those teeth, science has been constructing and reconstructing a picture of an animal for over a century. The picture has changed significantly. The size estimates have been revised downward. The behavior assumptions have been challenged. The timeline of its disappearance is still being argued. And the question of what the ocean actually lost when Megalodon vanished, what that absence has meant for the 3 million years of ocean ecology that followed, is one that paleontology is only beginning to answer seriously. If you enjoy drifting into the deep ocean and discovering what lies beneath, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Are you ready? Let's begin. The largest predator that has ever lived on Earth was a shark, not a dinosaur, not a marine reptile from the Mesozoic. A shark, recognizably a shark, with teeth and fins and a body plan that any child could identify from a picture book, and it was hunting in the ocean less than 4 million years ago. In geological terms, that is recent. The last Megalodon was alive while the ancestors of modern humans were walking upright across the African savanna, while early Homo was making stone tools, while the ice ages that would eventually shape the northern hemisphere were beginning to cycle through their first iterations. Otodus Megalodon was not a creature of the deep past in the way that Tyrannosaurus or Brachiosaurus are creatures of the deep past. It was present in the ocean during a period that the geological record treats as essentially modern, hunting prey in seas that were already populated by whales, dolphins, and the ancestors of the marine mammals alive today. And the question of exactly how large it was, which sounds like it should have a straightforward answer given that we have been finding its teeth for centuries, turns out to be one of the more contentious and repeatedly revised questions in vertebrate paleontology. The problem is not the teeth. The teeth of Otodus Megalodon are the most commonly recovered fossils of the animal, found on every continent that has marine sedimentary deposits from the Miocene and Pliocene epochs, washed out of cliffs, dredged from the seafloor, collected by amateur and professional fossil hunters in quantities that have made them among the most widely distributed large vertebrate fossils in the world. A Megalodon tooth is immediately recognizable. It is triangular, serrated along both edges, and can reach lengths exceeding 17 centimeters, which is roughly 3 times the length of the largest teeth of a great white shark. These teeth are not rare. They are sold in fossil shops, displayed in natural history museums, and collected as curiosities in quantities that reflect the abundance of the animal in the fossil record relative to its body size. The problem is that teeth are almost all we have. The skeleton of a shark is cartilaginous, not bony, and cartilage does not preserve well in the fossil record. When a shark stops functioning, its soft tissue decomposes rapidly, and its cartilaginous skeleton follows, leaving behind only the mineralized teeth and, occasionally, the calcified centra of the vertebrae. A complete or even substantially complete megalodon skeleton has never been found. Every size estimate for Otodus Megalodon is therefore an inference from fragmentary evidence, primarily from the teeth, and the method of inference has changed significantly over the past century in ways that have produced substantially different size estimates. The earliest systematic attempts to estimate Megalodon's size, conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, used a simple scaling approach. Researchers compared the Megalodon teeth to the teeth of the great white shark. Carcharodon carcharias measured the ratio of tooth size to body length in great whites and applied that ratio to Megalodon teeth to produce a body length estimate. This approach gave estimates in the range of 25 to 30 meters for the largest individuals, numbers that became widely cited in popular accounts and that persisted in the public imagination long after the scientific consensus had moved significantly away from them. The flaw in the method was not the scaling approach itself, but the choice of comparison animal. The great white shark was chosen because it was assumed to be the closest living relative of Megalodon. And while the two species share superficial similarities in body plan and diet, the taxonomic relationship between them has been substantially revised since the early scaling studies were conducted. The current scientific consensus is that Megalodon belongs to a separate lineage from the great white shark, the genus Otodus, and that the two species are not as closely related as the early studies assumed. The scaling relationships derived from great white sharks may therefore not accurately represent the proportions of Megalodon's body, and the tooth-to-body length ratios that produced the 30-meter estimates may have been systematically biased. The revision of Megalodon's size estimates gained significant momentum from a series of studies published between 2020 and 2022 that applied more sophisticated scaling methods to a larger sample of fossil material. The most comprehensive of these studies, published in 2022 by a team led by Kenshu Shimada at DePaul University, used scaling relationships derived not just from great white sharks, but from a wider range of shark species, including lamniform sharks more broadly, to produce body length estimates that were substantially lower than the historical consensus. The Shimada team's central estimate for a large adult Megalodon was approximately 14 to 15 meters, with the largest individuals possibly reaching 17 to 20 meters at the upper end of the uncertainty range. Even at the lower end of this range, 14 meters, Megalodon would have been approximately twice the length of the largest great white sharks on record and would have been the largest predatory shark known to science. At the upper end, 20 meters, it would have been a creature of a scale that makes comparison difficult. But the 30-meter estimates of the early 20th century, the ones that described a Megalodon as longer than a school bus by a factor of 2, are no longer supported by the best available analysis of the fossil material. What is still genuinely uncertain is the body shape of Megalodon. Body length is only one dimension of an animal's size, and for an animal known only from teeth and occasional vertebral centra, the question of how wide it was, how deep its body was, how massive it was relative to its length cannot be answered from the available evidence. Reconstructions of Megalodon's body shape have typically followed the great white shark model because the great white is the closest available analogy and because the teeth suggest broadly similar feeding habits. But the proportions of the great white, which has a relatively robust, deep-bodied shape compared to some other large sharks, may not be representative of Megalodon. A shark with Megalodon's tooth dimensions, but the proportions of a more slender-bodied species, would be a very different animal in terms of mass and volume from a shark with Megalodon's tooth dimensions and great white proportions. The mass estimates for Megalodon in the scientific literature span an even wider range than the length estimates, reflecting this additional dimension of uncertainty. Published mass estimates range from approximately 50 tons to over 100 tons for large individuals, a range that spans a factor of 2 and reflects genuine scientific disagreement rather than imprecision in the analysis. Adding a further layer of complexity is the question of sexual dimorphism. In modern lamniform sharks, females tend to be significantly larger than males, a pattern driven by the energetic demands of carrying and nourishing developing pups. If Megalodon followed the same pattern, the largest individuals in the fossil record would have been females, and the maximum size of males may have been meaningfully smaller. The bimodal distribution in Megalodon tooth sizes from some fossil sites is consistent with this interpretation, though the overlap between size classes and the limitations of fossil sampling make it tentative. The implication is that the largest teeth in museum collections represent the largest females, and the animal that most accounts describe as Megalodon is specifically a large female, with males occupying a somewhat different ecological role and size range that the fossil record has not yet fully resolved. The vertebral centra that have been recovered provide some additional information about Megalodon's body, but do not resolve the fundamental uncertainties. The largest known Megalodon vertebral centrum, a fossil recovered from Belgium and now housed in the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, has a diameter of approximately 15 centimeters, which is substantially larger than the vertebral centra of great white sharks and is consistent with a large animal. But the number of vertebrae in a Megalodon's spine, the spacing between them, and the relationship between vertebral centrum diameter and body length in lamniform sharks are not established with enough precision to use vertebral centra as accurate size indicators. The vertebral centra provide a lower bound on body size, confirming that the animal was large without providing the kind of precise measurement that would settle the debate about exactly how large. The comparison with Tyrannosaurus rex is instructive here precisely because of how badly it fails. Tyrannosaurus rex is known from dozens of substantially complete skeletons that preserve the skull, limbs, and spine in enough detail to allow accurate mass estimates and reliable reconstructions. The uncertainty on a Tyrannosaurus mass estimate is relatively small. The uncertainty on a Megalodon mass estimate spans a factor of 2 or more. The animal that was the apex predator of the Miocene and Pliocene oceans is less completely known from its fossil record than a dinosaur that stopped functioning 66 million years ago. The ocean does not preserve as well as terrestrial sediments, and the consequence is that the largest predator that has ever lived remains, at its center, an outline built from fragments. The question of Megalodon's maximum size connects to a broader question about the physical limits of predatory shark biology. The great white shark reaches a maximum reliably documented length of approximately 6 meters and a maximum mass of approximately 2,000 kilograms. At this size, it is already pushing against physiological constraints related to thermal regulation, oxygen delivery, and the biomechanics of hunting large prey. A shark substantially larger than a great white would face all of these constraints at a more extreme scale. Whether Megalodon was endothermic, capable of internally generating heat to maintain a body temperature above that of the surrounding water, is a question with significant implications for how it managed these constraints. And the isotopic chemistry of its teeth provides the most direct evidence available. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in tooth enamel reflects the temperature at which the tooth was formed. An analysis of Megalodon teeth from multiple sites has consistently indicated formation temperatures warmer than the ambient ocean at those sites, which is consistent with endothermy. A shark generating internal heat would form its teeth at a temperature above ambient water temperature, regardless of location, and that signature persists in the fossil enamel for millions of years. The oxygen isotope data does not definitively establish endothermy, because alternative explanations for elevated formation temperatures have been proposed, but it is consistent with it in a way that tooth morphology alone is not. Whether Megalodon was a fully endothermic animal or maintained only regional warmth in specific body regions, as the great white does, has implications for its energy budget, its geographic range, and the depths it could access, all of which connect directly to what it ate and how it hunted. The geographic distribution of Megalodon fossils is itself informative about the animal's biology and habitat preferences, though it must be read with an awareness of fossilization bias. Teeth are more likely to be preserved and discovered in shallow nearshore environments with high rates of sediment deposition than in deep water where currents and biological activity destroy organic material before it can mineralize. This means the nursery sites in warm, shallow coastal environments are disproportionately well represented in the fossil record relative to the offshore and deeper water environments where adults spent most of their time. With that caveat in mind, Megalodon teeth have been found at latitudes ranging from the tropics to approximately 55 degrees north and south, a range that suggests the animal was not restricted to warm tropical waters in the way that some large sharks are. The presence of Megalodon fossils at higher latitudes is consistent with endothermy because a shark capable of generating internal heat could maintain function in cooler water that would be too cold for an ectothermic animal of its size. The depth distribution of Megalodon fossils recovered from both shallow nearshore deposits and deeper offshore sediments suggests that the animal moved through a range of depths, though the shallow coastal environments appeared to have been particularly important for the nursery areas where young Megalodon grew. The fossil record contains nursery sites in warm, shallow coastal environments where small Megalodon teeth, corresponding to juveniles, are found in concentrations that suggest these areas were used specifically for the birth and early growth of young animals before they moved into the open ocean. This pattern is consistent with the behavior of modern large sharks, which often use sheltered coastal areas as nurseries, while adults range more widely in offshore waters. The size of Megalodon, whatever the true figure turns out to be when the fossil record eventually yields more complete material, was not merely a physical fact. It was an ecological reality that shaped the ocean around the animal in ways that reverberate through the marine ecosystem to the present. The largest predatory shark that has ever lived was not simply a bigger version of what came before it and what followed it. It was an organism of sufficient scale that its presence, and later its absence, left marks on the ocean's biological community that the fossil record and the modern ocean both preserve. That story begins with what Megalodon actually ate, and the answer is not what most accounts of the animal suggest. The fossil sites that have produced the most scientifically valuable Megalodon material are not the beach and nearshore locations where most amateur collectors find teeth. They are documented sedimentary outcrops where teeth are found in stratigraphic context, meaning their position within a known sequence of geological layers can be established, and the age of the containing sediment determined independently. The Calvert Cliffs of Maryland, the Lee Creek Mine in North Carolina, the Gatun Formation in Panama, the Bone Valley Formation in Florida, the deposits off the coast of Peru and Chile, and the continental shelf sediments of New Zealand and Australia have all produced Megalodon material in sufficient quantity and stratigraphic context to contribute to the understanding of the animal's temporal and geographic distribution. Teeth from these documented sites carry more scientific information than beach-collected specimens because their age can be established, their depositional environment can be characterized, and their association with other fossils can be used to reconstruct the ecological context in which the animal was living. The Gatun Formation in Panama, deposited when the Central American Seaway was still open and the Atlantic and Pacific were connected, preserves Megalodon teeth in association with the diverse marine mammal fauna of the early to middle Miocene, providing a snapshot of an ecosystem in which Megalodon was operating alongside whale and dolphin lineages that were still diversifying into the forms that would become the modern cetacean fauna. Reading the fossil record of Megalodon carefully, site by site and layer by layer, produces a picture of an animal whose presence and absence in the geological record traces the history of the ocean it lived in, as much as the history of the animal itself. The size is one part of that picture. What the animal actually did with that size is something the fossil record has only recently begun to reveal, and the answer is not what most people expect. The assumption that Megalodon hunted like a large great white shark is one of the most pervasive and least examined ideas in popular accounts of the animal. It is understandable. The great white is the largest living predatory shark. It shares a broadly similar tooth shape with Megalodon, and it is the animal that most people picture when they think of a large shark hunting large prey in the open ocean. But the assumption that a shark 3 times the length of a great white, operating in a different ocean, hunting different prey at a different period of evolutionary history, would use the same hunting strategies as a great white is not a scientific inference. It is a default, a filling of the unknown with the familiar, and the fossil evidence that has accumulated over the past 2 decades suggests that Megalodon's hunting behavior was, in several respects, significantly different from what the great white shark analogy predicts. The evidence comes primarily from whale bones. Fossil whale bones from Miocene and Pliocene deposits, the periods when Megalodon was alive, frequently bear bite marks and gouges that can be attributed to Megalodon based on the size, shape, and spacing of the marks, which correspond to the dimensions of Megalodon teeth. The pattern of these bite marks has been analyzed in detail in a series of studies that began producing results in the early 2000s. And what the patterns reveal about Megalodon's hunting strategy does not straightforwardly match the great white shark model. Great white sharks hunting large marine mammals typically attack from below and behind, targeting the soft tissue of the abdomen and flanks, where the organs are concentrated and where a single large bite can cause sufficient blood loss and organ damage to incapacitate the prey. The bite marks on fossil whale bones attributed to Megalodon show a different pattern. They are concentrated on the bones of the thorax, the ribs and vertebrae of the chest and midsection, in ways that suggest Megalodon was targeting the skeletal structure of its prey rather than the soft tissue around it. The implication is that Megalodon was crushing rather than slashing, using the enormous bite force generated by its jaws to damage the skeletal support structure of large whales, potentially targeting the heart and lungs by crushing the rib cage rather than by penetrating the soft tissue from the side or below. The bite force of Megalodon has been estimated from jaw reconstructions and from comparisons with the bite force scaling relationships of modern sharks. The estimates range widely depending on the size assumed for the animal and the method used to calculate force from jaw dimensions, but the most widely cited estimates place Megalodon's maximum bite force between approximately 40,000 and 180,000 newtons. For context, the bite force of a great white shark is estimated at approximately 18,000 newtons, and the bite force of a Tyrannosaurus rex has been estimated at approximately 35,000 to 57,000 newtons. The upper range of Megalodon bite force estimates would make it the most powerful bite ever measured in any animal, extinct or living, though the uncertainty on these estimates is large enough that precise comparisons are difficult to defend. What is not uncertain is that Megalodon's teeth, serrated and robust in a way that is optimized for cutting through dense material rather than simply piercing soft tissue, combined with a jaw that could open to an estimated width of approximately 2 to 3 meters, gave the animal a feeding apparatus of a scale and design that no living predator has matched. The prey that Megalodon targeted shifted over the course of its evolutionary history in ways that the fossil record documents, though incompletely. The earliest Megalodon ancestors, the Otodus lineage that extends back to the Eocene, were already large apex predators, but they were operating in an ocean that contained different assemblages of large marine mammals than the Miocene and Pliocene oceans, in which the largest Megalodon individuals are found. As the diversity of large baleen whales increased through the Miocene, driven by the productivity of the increasingly cold and nutrient-rich ocean, the available prey base for a large predatory shark expanded to include animals of a scale that earlier members of the lineage had not encountered. The largest megalodon individuals are found in the same deposits as the largest fossil mysticete whales, and the correspondence between megalodon size and whale size in the fossil record suggests that the evolution of large body size in megalodon was at least partly driven by the availability of large whale prey, which in turn required greater size and bite force to exploit effectively. The question of what size whale megalodon preferentially targeted is one that the bite mark evidence addresses only partially. Large adult baleen whales, of the kind that existed in the Miocene oceans, would have been formidable prey even for megalodon. A fully grown adult of the large baleen whale species present in megalodon's time would have been comparable in length to a megalodon individual and substantially heavier, given the denser body composition of a whale relative to a shark. A direct attack on a large, healthy adult whale would have been energetically costly and physically dangerous, and the pattern of bite marks concentrated on the skeletal structures of the thorax, rather than the softer extremities, may reflect a targeting strategy that aimed to disable prey quickly by structural damage rather than to outlast it through blood loss. Whether megalodon also scavenged whale carcasses, as great white sharks frequently do with the carcasses of large whales, is not directly evidenced by the fossil record, but is consistent with the opportunistic feeding behavior documented in modern large sharks, and is likely given the caloric value of a large whale carcass relative to the energy cost of active hunting. The size classes of whales most commonly associated with megalodon bite marks in the fossil record suggest that subadult and smaller adult baleen whales were the most frequently targeted prey, which is consistent with the optimization of predation on prey that is large enough to provide a substantial caloric return, but small enough to be subdued and consumed without the risks associated with attacking full-grown adults. This targeting of intermediate-sized prey is a pattern seen in large predators across a wide range of ecosystems, where the optimal prey size balances the caloric return against the energy and risk of the hunt. For megalodon, the optimal prey size appears to have been in the range of animals several meters long, juveniles and subadults of the large mysticete species that populated the Miocene and Pliocene oceans. And the evidence of predation on these size classes is more consistent and more clearly attributable to megalodon than the evidence of predation on large adults. The question of whether megalodon was a pursuit predator capable of sustained high-speed swimming to run down prey over distance, or an ambush predator using stealth and short bursts of acceleration to close on prey before it could react, is one that the fossil record cannot directly answer, but that the biomechanics of the animal's size and shape can inform. A shark of megalodon's estimated size and mass, even at the lower end of the size range, would have faced significant hydrodynamic drag in sustained high-speed swimming, which scales with the square of velocity and the frontal area of the body. The energy cost of sustained pursuit, swimming at the speeds required to run down a healthy adult whale, would have been enormous and potentially prohibitive. The ambush model, in which the shark approaches prey slowly from below or from a direction that minimizes the prey's ability to detect the approach, uses a short burst of acceleration to close the final distance and delivers a disabling bite before the prey can escape, is more consistent with the physics of a very large shark and with the bite mark evidence suggesting targeting of the thorax rather than the trailing extremities. The great white shark uses a version of this approach, attacking from below at speed in a single high-impact strike, and the application of a broadly similar strategy at Megalodon scale, with modifications for the larger prey size and the greater structural force of the bite, is consistent with both the physical constraints and the fossil evidence. The thermal physiology of Megalodon connects directly to the question of its geographic range and depth preference. The oxygen isotope evidence discussed in the context of its size is consistent with the degree of regional endothermy. The ability to maintain the temperature of certain body regions above ambient water temperature through the metabolic activity of swimming muscles, and a countercurrent heat exchange system in the blood vessels supplying those muscles. This is the system used by the great white shark and several other large lamniform sharks, and it allows them to function effectively in cooler water than a fully ectothermic shark of similar size could tolerate. If Megalodon had a similar or more developed regional endothermy, it would have been capable of accessing cooler water at greater depth and higher latitudes than a purely ectothermic animal, expanding its effective hunting range to include prey that sought refuge from surface predators in cooler, deeper water. The presence of Megalodon fossils at relatively high latitudes in both the northern and southern hemispheres is consistent with this expanded thermal range, and the implications for its hunting behavior include the possibility that Megalodon followed prey into the cooler water of the mesopelagic zone rather than being restricted to the warm surface layers. The social behavior of Megalodon, whether it was a solitary predator or whether adults aggregated in any context beyond chance encounters, is almost entirely unknown. Modern large sharks show variable social behavior, with great white sharks being primarily solitary, but aggregating at predictable prey concentrations, such as seal colonies, while some other large shark species show more consistent aggregation behavior. The fossil record of Megalodon does not preserve behavior directly, but the distribution of teeth at some fossil sites, where multiple teeth of similar size occur in close association, has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of multiple individuals feeding on the same whale carcass simultaneously, consistent with the aggregation behavior observed in great white sharks at large food sources. The interpretation of these associations as behavioral rather than taphonomic, the result of multiple carcasses being transported and deposited together by ocean currents, is not universally accepted, and the social behavior of Megalodon remains genuinely unknown. What the fossil record makes clear is that Megalodon was the unambiguous apex predator of the Miocene and Pliocene oceans for millions of years, and that nothing in the marine ecosystem of its time was large enough or fast enough to represent a consistent threat to a healthy adult. What brought it down was not a predator. It was something quieter, and in many ways more final. The teeth themselves, beyond their role as size proxies and bite mark sources, carry information about Megalodon's life history that has only recently begun to be systematically extracted. The growth rate of shark teeth, the rate at which enamel is deposited during tooth development, can be estimated from the microscopic structure of the enamel, and comparing growth rates between Megalodon teeth of different sizes provides information about how quickly individuals grew at different life stages. Studies of Megalodon tooth enamel microstructure, published in the early 2020s, have suggested that juvenile Megalodon grew rapidly in their early years, consistent with the high energy demands of a growing apex predator in a productive coastal nursery environment, before growth rates slowed in later life as the animal approached its maximum size. This pattern of rapid early growth, followed by slower growth in adulthood, is consistent with the life history strategies of modern large sharks and with the general principle that rapid early growth reduces the period of vulnerability to predation before the animal reaches a size at which it has no natural predators. A juvenile megalodon in a coastal nursery would have been vulnerable to larger predatory sharks and possibly to large marine crocodilians that shared some of its habitat. Reaching adult size quickly, even at the cost of high early energy expenditure, would have been strongly favored by selection. The teeth recorded this strategy in their microscopic structure, in the spacing of the growth bands that were laid down during their development, in a way that no behavioral observation of a living animal could provide, because the living animal no longer exists. The fossil is the record, and the record, read carefully with the right instruments, is still yielding information about an animal that has not been in the ocean for 3 million years. The nursery site evidence for Megalodon provides one of the clearest windows into the behavioral ecology of an animal that left so little else behind. Paleontologists have identified several locations in the fossil record where concentrations of small Megalodon teeth, ranging from a few centimeters to approximately 10 centimeters in length, and corresponding to juveniles and young subadults, occur in sedimentary deposits that indicate warm, shallow, productive coastal environments. These sites, found in what is now Panama, the Canary Islands, Maryland, and several other locations, represent the ancient coastlines where Megalodon mothers gave birth and where young animals spent their early years before moving into the open ocean as they grew. The concentration of juvenile teeth at these sites is not random. It reflects deliberate use of specific coastal environments that offered the combination of warm water, abundant small prey, and reduced exposure to the deep water predators that might have threatened young animals. The selection of nursery sites by large sharks is a behavior documented in modern species, including great white sharks and tiger sharks, and the fossil evidence suggests that Megalodon used a comparable strategy, partitioning its use of the ocean by life stage in a way that maximized the survival of young animals during the vulnerable period before they reached the size at which the open ocean became accessible. The nursery sites are among the most humanly accessible parts of the Megalodon fossil record. The teeth found there are smaller, more common, and more easily collected than the large adult teeth that draw attention in museum displays. But in some respects, they are more informative, because they document not just the existence of the animal, but a specific behavior, the protection of young, that connects Megalodon to the living world of predator ecology in a way that the giant teeth alone do not. The question of Megalodon's sensory biology, how it detected prey at range in the open ocean, is one that the fossil record cannot directly address, but that the comparative biology of modern lamniform sharks can inform. The great white shark and other large lamniform sharks use a combination of sensory systems to locate prey at different ranges. At long range, chemical detection through olfaction allows sharks to detect trace quantities of blood and other biological compounds dissolved in the water column, following the concentration gradient toward the source over distances of hundreds of meters to kilometers, depending on current conditions. At intermediate range, the lateral line system, a network of mechanoreceptive cells distributed along the shark's body and head, detects pressure waves and low-frequency vibrations in the water produced by the movement of other animals. At close range, electroreception through the ampullae of Lorenzini, gel-filled pores concentrated on the shark's snout, detects the weak electrical fields produced by the muscular contractions of nearby animals, allowing precise localization of prey even in conditions of complete darkness or turbidity, where visual detection is impossible. Megalodon almost certainly possessed all of these sensory systems, which are shared across the lamniform sharks and are ancestral features of the lineage. The question is one of scaling. A shark of Megalodon size would have had ampullae of Lorenzini distributed across a snout of significantly greater area than a great white's, potentially extending the range of electroreceptive detection. The lateral line system would have been distributed along a body many times longer than a great white's, potentially providing sensitivity to lower frequency vibrations over greater distances. Whether these scaling effects produced meaningfully greater sensory range or sensitivity in Megalodon compared to modern large sharks is not known, but the principle that larger lamniform sharks have enhanced versions of the sensory systems present in smaller ones is consistent with what is known about sensory system scaling across shark species. The animal that used all of these systems, that grew up in coastal nurseries and moved into the open ocean and hunted large whales for millions of years, stopped functioning 3.6 million years ago. What ended it was not anything that hunted it. It was something the ocean did to itself. The extinction of Megalodon is conventionally dated to approximately 3.6 million years ago during the Pliocene, a period when the global ocean was undergoing a transformation that would have been recognizable as catastrophic to any predator whose existence depended on the conditions that preceded it. The dating of the extinction is not as precise as the single figure suggests. The last confirmed Megalodon teeth in the fossil record come from deposits dated to approximately 3.6 million years ago. But the disappearance of an animal from the fossil record and the actual cessation of the last individual are not the same thing. An animal can stop appearing in the fossil record because it went locally extinct in the areas that are well represented in the geological record while continuing to exist elsewhere, or because the conditions that favor fossilization changed in ways that make teeth less likely to be preserved and found, or because sampling of the relevant time period is incomplete. The 3.6 million year figure is a robust estimate based on the available evidence, but the actual end of Megalodon may have been somewhat earlier or later, and the geographic pattern of the extinction, which populations disappeared first and which persisted longest, is not well resolved in the current fossil record. What is well established is the context in which the extinction occurred. The late Pliocene was a period of significant global cooling driven by the intensification of northern hemisphere glaciation, a process that transformed the thermal structure of the world's oceans in ways that had cascading effects on marine productivity, species distributions, and food web structure. The closure of the Central American Seaway, the shallow marine corridor that had connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans across what is now Panama, was completed approximately 3 million years ago and fundamentally altered the circulation of the tropical ocean, reducing the mixing of Atlantic and Pacific water masses and changing the distribution of nutrients and productivity across both basins. The cooling of the ocean that accompanied these changes reduced the productivity of the warm, shallow coastal environments that Megalodon's prey depended on and that Megalodon's nursery areas required, compressing the warm water zone toward the tropics and reducing the total area of ocean that could support the prey base of the largest marine predator that had ever existed. The prey collapse hypothesis for Megalodon's extinction holds that the cooling of the ocean and the associated changes in marine productivity caused a significant decline in the populations of the large baleen whales that Megalodon depended on as its primary food source. The fossil record of large mysticete whales from the late Pliocene shows a decline in diversity and abundance that correlates with the period of Megalodon's disappearance, consistent with the hypothesis that the prey base contracted at the same time that the predator vanished. An apex predator that requires large amounts of high-quality prey to sustain its own metabolic demands, and that has a slow reproductive rate that limits its ability to recover from population decline, is particularly vulnerable to a reduction in prey availability. Megalodon's estimated metabolic demands, given its size and probable thermal physiology, were enormous. A large adult Megalodon, at the lower end of the size estimates, would have required the caloric equivalent of a significant fraction of a large whale per week to maintain its body mass and activity level. In an ocean where the density of large prey was declining and the geographic range of productive hunting grounds was contracting, the energy budget of the largest individuals would have become increasingly difficult to balance. The competition hypothesis adds another dimension to the extinction story. The late Pliocene and early Pleistocene saw the diversification of killer whales, Orcinus orca, and the large dolphin lineages that preceded them, into apex predators capable of hunting large baleen whales in groups. Killer whales hunt cooperatively, using coordinated group tactics to isolate and exhaust prey that a single predator could not overcome, and their cognitive sophistication, social cohesion, and behavioral flexibility give them advantages in a changing environment that a solitary apex predator of Megalodon's type could not match. The emergence of efficient, socially sophisticated whale predators in the same ocean at the same time that Megalodon was disappearing is not necessarily a causal relationship, but it represents a significant change in the competitive landscape for large whale prey. If killer whale ancestors were able to exploit large whale prey more efficiently than Megalodon under the changing conditions of the late Pliocene Ocean, the effective prey availability for Megalodon would have declined even faster than the raw abundance of large whales. The stellar sea cow, Hydrodamylus gigas, provides an instructive, modern analogy for what can happen to a large marine mammal population when its top predator disappears, though the analogy runs in the opposite direction from the Megalodon story. The stellar's sea cow a massive kelp-feeding marine mammal that reached lengths of approximately 8 meters and was discovered by European explorers in the Commander Islands in the North Pacific in 1741, was hunted to extinction within 27 years of its discovery. Before its extinction, it had already been reduced to a relict population confined to a few remote islands, having presumably been much more widely distributed before intensive hunting by indigenous peoples had reduced it over centuries. The point of the analogy is that a large, slow-reproducing marine mammal whose population has been compressed by pressure from one direction, whether hunting or prey reduction, can decline to extinction faster than intuition suggests when additional pressure is applied. Megalodon, as a large, slow-reproducing apex predator with a restricted prey base and a nursery habitat that was being compressed by ocean cooling, may have been in a similarly vulnerable position when the prey collapse and competitive pressure of the late Pliocene were applied. The claim that Megalodon might still be alive in the deep ocean, a claim that surfaces regularly in popular media, and that was the premise of a widely viewed fictional film in 2018, can be addressed directly and briefly. It is not scientifically credible, and the reasons why illuminate something important about what the ocean can and cannot hide. Megalodon was not a deep-sea animal. The fossil record places it overwhelmingly in shallow coastal and continental shelf environments, with the nursery sites in warm, shallow water and the adult feeding areas in the productive waters over continental shelves where large baleen whales concentrated. The deep ocean, below approximately 1,000 meters, is cold, dark, and relatively unproductive, and the large baleen whale prey that Megalodon depended on does not concentrate there. An animal of Megalodon's size and metabolic demands could not sustain itself in the deep ocean on the prey available there. More fundamentally, an animal of Megalodon's size could not exist in the modern ocean without leaving evidence that science would have detected. A large predatory shark of Megalodon's estimated dimensions would need to eat the equivalent of a large whale regularly. Whale populations are monitored globally by acoustic arrays, satellite tags, and aerial surveys. Whale carcasses with bite marks of the size that Megalodon would produce, crushing marks on the ribcage of animals many meters long, would be immediately recognizable and would have been documented repeatedly if Megalodon were present in any ocean basin in sufficient numbers to sustain a breeding population. No such evidence exists. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but in the case of an animal that would need to eat whale-sized prey regularly in an ocean that is monitored more thoroughly than at any previous point in history, the absence of evidence is strongly indicative of actual absence. Megalodon is not hiding in the deep ocean. It is not avoiding detection. It stopped functioning approximately 3.6 million years ago, and the ocean it lived in has been a different ocean ever since. The timing of Megalodon's extinction relative to the evolution of modern large whale species is one of the more consequential coincidences in the history of marine life. The blue whale, the fin whale, the humpback, and the other large baleen whale species that now constitute the largest animals alive did not exist in their modern form while Megalodon was present. The lineages that would give rise to these species were present, but the modern species themselves diversified and reached their current sizes after Megalodon's extinction. In an ocean that no longer contained the apex predator that had been hunting large baleen whales for millions of years. The removal of that predation pressure, the disappearance of the only predator capable of consistently threatening large baleen whales, is likely one of the factors that allowed large baleen whale species to reach the sizes they currently achieve. A blue whale growing to 30 meters in an ocean that contained Megalodon would have been a prey item of the highest caloric value, and the selection pressure of consistent predation by an animal capable of crushing the rib cage of a large whale would have favored different life history strategies than those that allow the modern blue whale to reach maximum size. The ocean without Megalodon was an ocean in which the largest possible body size for a baleen whale was no longer a liability, and the whales that followed took advantage of that change in ways that the fossil record of the past 3 million years clearly documents. What Megalodon left behind when it vanished was not merely an absence. It was a space that the ocean filled in ways that Megalodon's presence had prevented. The supernova hypothesis for Megalodon's extinction, proposed in a 2019 paper by researchers at the University of Kansas, adds an unexpected dimension to the extinction story that remains speculative but is based on physical evidence. The hypothesis holds that a supernova explosion approximately 2.5 million years ago, at a distance of approximately 50 light-years from Earth, produced a flux of cosmic rays that reached the Earth's surface at elevated levels for an extended period, potentially increasing the mutation rate in living organisms and contributing to the marine megafauna extinctions of the late Pliocene. The evidence cited includes an elevated concentration of iron-60, a radioactive isotope produced by supernovae in deep-sea sediment cores from the relevant time period. The iron-60 signal is real and has been confirmed in multiple sediment cores from different ocean basins, indicating a genuine extraterrestrial input of supernova-produced material approximately 2.5 million years ago. Whether the cosmic ray flux associated with this supernova was sufficient to meaningfully increase mutation rates and contribute to extinction is more uncertain, and the hypothesis has not achieved broad acceptance in the paleontological community, which generally attributes the late Pliocene marine megafauna extinctions primarily to the oceanographic and ecological changes associated with global cooling. The supernova hypothesis does not replace the prey collapse and climate explanations. It adds a possible additional factor to an extinction that was probably multi-causal, driven by the convergence of oceanographic change, prey decline, competitive pressure, and potentially cosmic events whose effects on marine biology are still being assessed. The reproductive biology of Megalodon, inferred from what is known about the reproduction of modern large sharks, provides the final piece of the vulnerability picture. Large lamniform sharks, including the great white, have low reproductive rates. Females reach sexual maturity late, carry pups for extended gestation periods, and produce relatively small litters of large, well-developed young. The great white shark is estimated to produce litters of 2 to 10 pups after a gestation period of approximately 11 months, and females reproduce infrequently, with intervals of several years between litters. If Megalodon had broadly similar reproductive characteristics, scaled for its larger body size, its reproductive rate would have been even lower than the great whites, with fewer pups per litter, longer gestation, longer intervals between litters, and a later age at sexual maturity. A population with this kind of reproductive biology cannot rapidly compensate for increased adult mortality or decreased juvenile survival. When the prey base contracts and the nursery environments compress, the reproductive rate that would allow a population to sustain itself through the transition is simply not available. Megalodon could not reproduce its way out of the late Pliocene. The ocean was changing faster than the animal could adapt, and the result, 3.6 million years later in the fossil record, is an absence where the largest predator that has ever existed used to be. What that absence means for the ocean that inherited it is a story that runs to the present day. The geographic pattern of Megalodon's decline, to the extent that the fossil record allows it to be reconstructed, suggests that the extinction was not simultaneous across all populations. The fossil record shows earlier disappearances in the higher latitude populations, consistent with the cooling of polar and subpolar waters, reducing the productivity of those environments faster than the tropical and subtropical regions. The last Megalodon populations appear to have persisted longest in the tropics, where the warm water environments that the nursery sites required were compressed but not entirely eliminated in the late Pliocene. This pattern of sequential population loss from the periphery of the range inward toward the refuge of the tropics is consistent with the response of other marine species to climate-driven range contractions and provides a more detailed picture of how the extinction unfolded than the single date of 3.6 million years ago suggests. An extinction of this kind, progressive and driven by the contraction of suitable habitat rather than by a single catastrophic event, is not a sudden ending. It is a slow withdrawal, a population-by-population retreat toward the last remaining conditions that could support the species until the last conditions contracted to a point that could not support even the final population. The ocean closed around Megalodon gradually, taking millions of years to reach the point at which there was no longer anywhere left for the largest predator that had ever lived to sustain itself. And then it was gone, leaving behind its teeth in the sediment and a silence in the food web that nothing has yet fully occupied. The isotopic evidence for ocean cooling during the late Pliocene is preserved in the same kinds of deep-sea sediment cores that contain the iron-60 signal from the supernova hypothesis, and the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence pointing to the same period of environmental change provides some of the strongest support for the climate-driven extinction model. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in the shells of foraminifera, single-celled organisms that lived in the surface ocean and whose shells accumulated in seafloor sediment over millions of years, changes in predictable ways with ocean temperature and the global volume of ice. When ocean temperatures cool and ice sheets expand, locking up water with relatively low heavy oxygen content, the heavy oxygen concentration in seawater and in the shells of organisms that build their shells from seawater increases. The oxygen isotope record from sediment cores therefore provides a continuous record of ocean temperature and ice volume going back tens of millions of years, and the record for the late Pliocene shows a clear and sustained shift toward cooler temperatures and larger ice volumes beginning approximately 3 to 4 million years ago, the same period during which Megalodon's fossil record shows declining abundance and eventually disappears. The physical evidence for the environmental change that drove the extinction is robust and well documented. The connection between that environmental change and the specific mechanisms of Megalodon's decline, the prey collapse, the nursery habitat compression, the competitive pressure from killer whale ancestors, is inferred from the correlation and from what is known about the ecology of large apex predators rather than directly observed. But the inference is well supported and is the consensus interpretation of the available evidence. The question of whether any Megalodon population could have survived in a refuge environment, some region of the late Pliocene Ocean, where conditions remained favorable long after they had deteriorated elsewhere, is one that the geographic pattern of fossil disappearances addresses. The evidence for persistence in tropical refugia is consistent with what is known about climate-driven range contractions in other marine species. Species facing climate-driven range compression typically persist longest in the core of their thermal range, where conditions remain closest to optimal as the periphery becomes uninhabitable. For Megalodon, the tropics represented this core, and the fossil record is consistent with persistence there after higher latitude populations had vanished. But the tropics were not immune to the oceanographic changes of the late Pliocene. The closure of the Central American Seaway altered tropical circulation, and the large whale prey on which Megalodon depended were themselves responding to the global changes in ways that would have reduced their availability even in the refugia. The tropical refuge bought time. It did not prevent the outcome. The modern ocean is a product of absences as much as presences. The species that are alive today, their distributions, their behaviors, their body sizes, their population dynamics, have all been shaped not only by the predators and competitors they currently face, but by the predators and competitors that are no longer present. The removal of a top predator from an ecosystem does not simply leave a gap that other species flow into unchanged. It restructures the entire system, releasing populations that were previously suppressed, allowing behaviors that were previously too dangerous, and changing the physical environment in ways that ripple through every level of the food web. The ecological term for this kind of cascading effect is a trophic cascade, and the extinction of Megalodon 3.6 million years ago set in motion one of the longest and most consequential trophic cascades in the history of marine life. The ocean that exists today, with its populations of blue whales and humpbacks and sperm whales, is in part the product of that cascade, shaped by the absence of the predator that preceded them. The concept of the landscape of fear, developed by behavioral ecologists studying terrestrial ecosystems in the late 20th century, holds that the presence of a large predator shapes the behavior of prey animals across an entire landscape, not just in the immediate vicinity of predator-prey encounters. Prey animals modify their movement patterns, their habitat use, their foraging behavior, and their reproductive strategies in response to the risk of predation, and these behavioral modifications have cascading effects on the vegetation, the hydrology, and the physical structure of the environment. The classic example is the effect of wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone National Park. where the return of wolves after decades of absence changed the behavior of elk in ways that allowed streamside vegetation to recover, which in turn changed stream hydrology and geomorphology, affecting species across many taxonomic groups. The wolves did not just kill elk. Their presence changed how elk used the landscape, and that behavioral change propagated through the entire ecosystem. The marine equivalent of this landscape of fear operates on the open ocean in ways that are harder to document than the terrestrial version, but are increasingly well supported by evidence from modern marine ecosystems. Large sharks shape the distribution and behavior of their prey in ways that extend far beyond the areas where they actually hunt. Populations of sea turtles, marine mammals, and large fish modify their habitat use, their diving behavior, and their foraging patterns in response to shark presence, and these modifications have effects on the ecosystems they in turn influence. The removal of large sharks from marine ecosystems through overfishing has been documented to produce cascading effects that include increases in prey populations, changes in the distribution of grazing pressure, and modifications of habitat structure in ways that parallel the terrestrial examples. Megalodon, as the largest shark predator the ocean has ever contained, would have generated a landscape of fear on a scale that no modern predator approaches. The behavioral modifications it imposed on large baleen whale populations, the restrictions on where whales could safely forage, rest, and raise young, would have shaped the distribution of whale feeding pressure across entire ocean basins. The release from that landscape of fear when Megalodon vanished would have been one of the most significant behavioral liberations in the history of marine mammals. Whale populations that had been restricting their behavior, their habitat use, and their body size in response to Megalodon predation risk were suddenly free to use the full range of the ocean without the behavioral constraints imposed by a predator capable of crushing their rib cages. The colonization of high-latitude feeding grounds by large baleen whales, the development of long-distance migrations between equatorial breeding areas and polar feeding areas, the evolution of the extremely large body sizes that characterize modern mysticete species, all of these are developments that became possible after Megalodon's extinction, and that may have been constrained during Megalodon's reign by the costs of avoiding a predator that ranged across a wide thermal and geographic range. Whether any of these developments were directly caused by Megalodon's extinction, or whether they would have occurred anyway on the same timescale, is impossible to determine with certainty. But the correlation between the disappearance of the ocean's dominant apex predator and the subsequent radiation of large baleen whales into their modern ecological roles is consistent with a causal connection. The sperm whale, Physeter macrocephalus, provides a specific example of how the post-Megalodon ocean may have enabled behaviors that would have been dangerous in the presence of the apex predator. Sperm whales dive to depths of over 2,000 meters and spend extended periods up to 90 minutes in the deep ocean hunting giant squid. This diving behavior takes the whale into a depth zone where it is effectively helpless during the ascent, unable to swim fast enough to avoid a predator that might be waiting near the surface, and where the physiological demands of the deep dive compromise its ability to respond rapidly to surface threats. A sperm whale returning from a deep dive in an ocean containing Megalodon would have been at elevated risk during the ascent and surface recovery period, and the evolution of such extreme diving behavior would have faced selective pressure against it if surface predation by a large, fast-attacking apex shark was a consistent risk. The development of deep, long-duration diving in sperm whales and the associated evolution of echolocation capabilities sophisticated enough to hunt effectively in complete darkness at extreme depth may have been facilitated by the removal of the surface predation risk that Megalodon represented. The nutrient cycling implications of Megalodon's extinction connect to the whale pump discussion in ways that extend the ecological legacy beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. Large baleen whales cycle iron and other nutrients from deep feeding areas to the surface through their fecal plumes, stimulating phytoplankton productivity and contributing to biological carbon sequestration. The recovery and expansion of large baleen whale populations after Megalodon's extinction, enabled by the release from predation pressure, would have increased the total whale biomass in the ocean, and with it, the intensity of the whale pump. An ocean with larger populations of larger baleen whales cycling more nutrients through their feeding and defecation would have been a more productive ocean, with more phytoplankton, more zooplankton, more fish, and more carbon sequestration than an ocean where baleen whale populations were suppressed by predation. Megalodon's extinction, therefore, had effects on the global carbon cycle that operated through the indirect pathway of whale population release, adding a biogeochemical dimension to the ecological legacy of the largest predator that has ever lived. The fossil record of the 3 million years following Megalodon's extinction documents the marine mammal radiation that the trophic cascade enabled. Though the attribution of specific evolutionary events to the absence of Megalodon rather than to other concurrent changes is always uncertain, the diversification of large baleen whale species, the colonization of polar feeding grounds, the evolution of complex social behaviors in cetaceans, the development of sophisticated communication systems, all occurred in the post-Megalodon ocean, and all potentially benefited from the behavioral freedoms that the loss of the apex predator allowed. This does not mean that Megalodon's extinction was good for the ocean in any simple sense. The loss of an apex predator always simplifies an ecosystem, reducing the complexity of the food web and potentially destabilizing dynamics that the predator was regulating. But the specific trajectory of the post-Megalodon ocean toward larger whales, more complex cetacean social structures, and more intense nutrient cycling is a trajectory that the presence of Megalodon would likely have constrained. The modern great white shark occupies the ecological niche of large apex shark predator in the current ocean, but it occupies that niche at a scale that is dramatically reduced from the niche that Megalodon filled. The great white hunts large marine mammals, but the marine mammals it most consistently targets, seals and sea lions, are orders of magnitude smaller than the large baleen whales that Megalodon hunted. Attacks by great white sharks on large baleen whales are documented, but are not a consistent feature of whale ecology in the way that Megalodon predation presumably was. The great white is the largest living predatory shark, but it is not the ecological successor to Megalodon in any meaningful sense. The niche that Megalodon filled, the systematic predation of large baleen whales by a shark of comparable size, is empty. No living predator consistently fills it. Killer whales hunt large baleen whales in groups and are the closest functional analog to what Megalodon did, but they do so through cooperative behavior and cognitive sophistication rather than through individual size, and the scale of their impact on large whale populations, while significant, is different in character from what a solitary ambush predator of Megalodon's dimensions would have achieved. The empty niche left by Megalodon is not simply an abstract ecological concept. It has measurable consequences for the modern ocean. Without a large solitary apex predator consistently hunting large baleen whales, the behavioral modifications that whale populations make in response to predation risk are calibrated to killer whales rather than to Megalodon. Killer whales hunt in pods, are noisy, are detectable acoustically at range, and tend to target specific age classes and health conditions of prey. The behavioral responses of whale populations to killer whale predation, the vigilance behaviors, the group cohesion, the preference for certain habitats, are different from the responses that would be optimal against a large, solitary ambush predator like Megalodon. The ocean's large whale populations have been behaviorally calibrated by 3.6 million years of evolution without Megalodon. They have lost, if they ever possessed, the specific behavioral adaptations that Megalodon's presence would have selected for. What the modern ocean would look like if Megalodon had never gone extinct is impossible to know. What it would look like if Megalodon somehow returned is a question that ecology can address with some confidence, and the answer suggests that the cascading effects would be significant, disruptive, and felt across every level of the marine food web that large whale populations currently influence. The deep-sea manganese nodule evidence for Megalodon's persistence provides one of the more unusual data points in the debate about the timing of the extinction. Manganese nodules are mineral concretions that grow on the deep-sea floor by the slow deposition of dissolved manganese and other metals from the overlying water column. They grow extremely slowly, at rates of approximately 1 to 2 centimeters per million years, and their growth layers can be dated by uranium series methods with reasonable precision. Several Megalodon teeth have been found embedded in or associated with manganese nodules whose growth layers suggest the teeth were incorporated into the nodule relatively recently in geological terms, within the past 11,000 to 33,000 years. If accurate, these dates would imply that Megalodon survived until the late Pleistocene or even into the early Holocene, an astonishing revision of the extinction date. The teeth in nodules evidence has been examined critically, and the consensus among paleontologists is that the dating of nodule layers is not sufficiently precise to distinguish between a tooth incorporated 20,000 years ago and one incorporated 3 million years ago, because the outer layers of nodules accumulate material and rework older material in ways that can produce misleading dates. The nodule-dated teeth are not considered reliable evidence for a late extinction, and the paleontological consensus remains that Megalodon stopped functioning approximately 3.6 million years ago. But the existence of such claims in the scientific literature illustrates how much the question of Megalodon's extinction continues to generate interest and investigation even after the broad outlines of the answer have been established. The paleoecological modeling of the Megalodon ecosystem, combining what is known about Megalodon's size, diet, and range with models of Pliocene ocean productivity and prey availability, has provided quantitative estimates of how many Megalodon individuals the late Miocene and Pliocene ocean could have supported, and how that carrying capacity changed as ocean conditions shifted. These models, published primarily in the 2010s and 2020s, suggest that global megalodon populations were never large in absolute terms. An apex predator of megalodon size, with its enormous metabolic demands and its dependence on large prey, could be supported only by an ocean with high productivity and dense populations of large prey animals. The carrying capacity estimates for Megalodon range from a few thousand to perhaps tens of thousands of individuals globally, comparable to the current population of blue whales. A global population of this size, with Megalodon's slow reproductive rate, would have been vulnerable to rapid decline if prey availability fell significantly. The population models suggest that once the prey base began contracting in the late Pliocene, the Megalodon population would have entered a decline that, given the reproductive constraints, could not have been reversed, even if conditions had subsequently improved. The extinction, viewed through the lens of population modeling, was not a sudden collapse. It was the inevitable conclusion of a slow demographic decline that began when the ocean changed in ways the animal could not compensate for. And the silence it left in the food web has been the ocean's condition for longer than our species has existed to notice it. The behavioral ecology of modern apex shark species provides additional context for understanding how Megalodon's presence would have structured the Miocene and Pliocene ocean. Studies of tiger shark effects on seagrass ecosystems in Shark Bay, Australia, have demonstrated that the landscape of fear generated by tiger sharks causes dugongs and sea turtles to avoid high-quality foraging patches in areas with restricted escape routes, even when those patches contain abundant food. The avoidance behavior of the prey animals, maintained by the risk of predation even in the absence of actual predation events, reduces grazing pressure in the most productive areas and distributes it more evenly across the landscape. This redistribution of grazing pressure has measurable effects on seagrass density and distribution, on sediment stability, and on the carbon storage capacity of the seagrass ecosystem. The tiger shark, a medium-sized apex predator, generates these landscape-scale effects through behavior alone, without needing to be present everywhere at once or to kill prey frequently. The presence, or more precisely the perceived risk of the presence, is sufficient to modify the behavior of prey animals in ways that restructure the ecosystem. Megalodon, operating at a scale several times larger and generating a landscape of fear across entire ocean basins rather than a coastal bay, would have produced analogous but vastly amplified effects on the distribution of whale feeding pressure across the Miocene and Pliocene ocean. The areas where large whales could safely congregate to feed, rest, and calve would have been structured by the distribution of Megalodon predation risk, and the productivity consequences of that structured distribution would have been felt at the level of ocean basin productivity rather than coastal ecosystem structure. The recovery of large shark populations from overfishing in the modern ocean provides natural experiments in what happens when apex shark predators are removed from and then returned to marine ecosystems. In several regions where shark populations have been severely reduced by fishing pressure and have subsequently begun recovering following protection, measurable changes in the behavior and distribution of prey species have been documented. The reappearance of large sharks in areas where they had been absent for years has caused prey populations to redistribute, avoiding areas that were previously safe and restoring the landscape of fear that their absence had eliminated. These recovery experiments are imperfect analogs to the Megalodon situation because the scale is different and the species involved are different. But they demonstrate the principle that apex shark predators shape ecosystem structure through their behavioral effects on prey, that these effects disappear when the predators are removed, and that they return when the predators return. Megalodon's extinction was a permanent removal, not a temporary absence, and the 3.6 million years that have elapsed since have been long enough for the ocean to reorganize around the absence rather than around any expectation of return. The modern ocean is calibrated to the predators it currently contains, not to the predator it lost. What that lost predator would have meant for the ocean we now inhabit had it never vanished is a question that ecology can frame but cannot fully answer. There is a particular quality to the absence of something that was once the largest and most powerful thing in its environment. Not the absence of something small or peripheral, something whose disappearance leaves the system broadly unchanged, the absence of the apex. The disappearance of the thing that everything else organized itself around, that set the terms for what was dangerous and what was safe, what behaviors were possible and which were prohibitively costly. When that thing is gone, the system does not simply continue without it. It reorganizes. It explores possibilities that the apex made unavailable. It fills space in ways that the apex prevented. And the reorganization, if it proceeds long enough, produces a system so different from what preceded it that the original configuration becomes difficult to imagine. The modern ocean is that reorganized system. The blue whale and the humpback and the sperm whale are the organisms that fill the space the Megalodon left. And the ocean they inhabit, the ocean that exists today, is in some fundamental sense the ocean that Megalodon's absence made possible. This is not a comfortable framing for an animal that popular culture has consistently cast as a monster. The idea that Megalodon's disappearance was, in ecological terms, the precondition for the marine world we now inhabit, including the blue whale whose biology so many people find awe-inspiring, sits uneasily with the narrative of the terrifying predator that is better gone. But ecology does not deal in monsters. It deals in roles, in energy flows, in the relationships between population sizes, and the behaviors that sustain them. Megalodon was an apex predator that performed functions in its ecosystem that apex predators perform in all ecosystems, regulating prey populations, structuring the landscape of fear, influencing the evolution of prey behaviors and body sizes. It did these things at a scale that no other marine predator has matched before or since. And when it stopped doing them, the marine ecosystem underwent a reorganization that produced, among other things, the largest animal that has ever existed. The relationship between Megalodon and the blue whale is therefore not simply the relationship between predator and prey across geological time. It is the relationship between a constraint and what is released when the constraint is removed. The blue whale exists at its current size partly because the selection pressure that would have penalized large size in the presence of Megalodon was removed 3.6 million years ago. The 30-meter body, the 150-ton mass, the heart the size of a small car, these are in part the products of an evolutionary freedom that Megalodon's extinction granted. The largest animal that has ever lived owes something of its existence to the disappearance of the largest predator that has ever lived. The ocean keeps these connections in its biology and its fossil record in ways that are not always obvious, but that are real, and that connect the present to a past that is longer and stranger than the human timescale tends to accommodate. The question of what Megalodon represents in the human imagination, separate from what it was in the Miocene and Pliocene ocean, is worth considering briefly. The fascination with Megalodon in popular culture, the films, the television specials, the merchandise, the persistent belief among some people that it might still be alive, reflects something about the human relationship with scale and with the ocean that is not simply an error to be corrected. The ocean is vast, it is poorly understood, and the existence of an animal of Megalodon's dimensions is genuinely difficult to process against the backdrop of the largest things in everyday human experience. The intuition that something so large could not simply be gone, that the ocean is surely big enough to hide it, is not an irrational intuition, even though it is wrong. It reflects a correct perception of the ocean's scale, combined with an incorrect inference about what that scale implies for the possibility of hiding large animals. The ocean is vast enough to hide many things. It is not vast enough to hide an animal that needs to eat whale-sized prey regularly in a world where whale populations are monitored globally. But the intuition that generated the question is not contemptible. It is a response to genuine scale. The fossil record of Megalodon is a record of scale in the most direct possible sense. The teeth that wash out of coastal cliffs and are found on beaches from Maryland to Morocco to New Zealand are physical objects of a size that makes their origin impossible to misidentify. A tooth 17 centimeters long, serrated along both edges, triangular, made of the same material as the teeth of living sharks but 3 times larger, is not an ambiguous object. It is direct physical evidence of something that was real, that existed in the ocean, that was hunting in waters that are in most respects the same waters that exist today. And that was doing so recently enough in geological time that the ocean it inhabited and the ocean we inhabit are separated by a gap that is short compared to the history of life. The tooth connects the finder to the animal in a way that a dinosaur bone does not quite manage, because the ocean is still there, because the same depths of water that Megalodon moved through are still present, because the whales that were its prey are still swimming. The context for Megalodon is not extinct, only the animal is. The scientific work on Megalodon that has been most productive in the past 2 decades has shared a common characteristic with the best science on other poorly preserved fossil animals. It has focused on what can be known rather than on filling gaps with speculation. The isotopic chemistry of the teeth, the microstructure of the enamel, the pattern of bite marks on whale bones, the distribution of nursery sites. These are specific, measurable, falsifiable lines of evidence that have produced specific, defensible conclusions. The size estimates have been revised not because paleontologists changed their minds arbitrarily, but because better methods applied to more fossil material produced more reliable results. The behavioral inferences have been developed not from imagination, but from the physical constraints of a large animal's biomechanics, and from the patterns preserved in the bones of its prey. The science of Megalodon is incomplete and will remain incomplete because the fossil record is incomplete and because the animal is gone and cannot be observed. But the incompleteness is being addressed methodically. And the picture that is emerging from that methodical work is more interesting and more scientifically significant than the mythological version that popular culture has constructed around the same evidence. The ocean that Megalodon swam through was an ocean in the process of becoming the ocean we know. The major ocean basins were configured similarly to their current form. The temperature was somewhat warmer on average, but the fundamental structure of ocean circulation, the thermohaline conveyor, the deep water formation in the polar seas, the upwelling zones along the eastern boundaries of the ocean basins was already in place. The prey that Megalodon hunted were the ancestors of the whales alive today, already evolved into recognizably modern forms, already performing the ecological functions that modern whales perform. The ocean of the Miocene and Pliocene was not a foreign world. It was the modern ocean with Megalodon in it. The transformation from that ocean to the current one is primarily the story of Megalodon's removal and what grew in its absence. 3.6 million years of reorganization, of evolutionary radiation, of behavioral recalibration, of nutrient cycling intensification have produced the ocean that exists today. And that ocean, for all the pressure that human activity has placed on it in the past 2 centuries, retains the fundamental structure that Megalodon's absence made possible. The blue whale is still here. The sperm whale still dives to 2,000 meters. The humpback still migrates from the tropics to the poles and back. The ocean still operates on timescales and at scales that the human mind struggles to hold. The scale problem that Megalodon poses to the imagination is in some ways the same problem that the ocean itself poses. Both exceed the categories that everyday human experience calibrates intuition to handle. A shark 14 to 20 meters long, with a bite force sufficient to crush the ribcage of a large whale, hunting in an ocean that already contained recognizable modern whales, is an entity that sits at the edge of what the mind can comfortably hold as real. And yet, it was real. The teeth are real. The bite marks on fossil whale bones are real. The isotopic signatures in the enamel are real. The nursery sites with their concentrations of juvenile teeth are real. Megalodon's reality is not in question. Only its details remain to be filled in, and those details are being filled in, slowly and carefully, by researchers who are reading the evidence rather than the mythology. The mythology of Megalodon, the monster of the deep that might still be hiding somewhere in the darkness, is a human creation that says something true about the ocean's power to generate awe and uncertainty. But the actual animal, the one that left its teeth in the sediment of every ocean basin, was more interesting than the mythology. It was a real predator in a real ecosystem, performing real ecological functions, and its disappearance had real consequences that the ocean is still living with. That is enough. More than enough. The real Megalodon, reconstructed from teeth and isotopes and bite marks and population models, is stranger and more consequential than any monster. The paradox at the center of the Megalodon story is that the animal's disappearance was both a loss and a precondition. It was a loss because the ocean is less complex, less ecologically layered, less structured by the landscape of fear that an apex predator of that scale generates. Without it, the food web that Megalodon anchored was a more complex food web than the one that replaced it, and the removal of complexity from an ecosystem is never a simple neutral event. It was a precondition because the specific forms of complexity that replaced it, the radiation of large baleen whales, the development of sophisticated cetacean cognition and communication, the intensification of the whale pump, required the space that Megalodon's absence opened. The ocean did not become simpler when Megalodon vanished. It became differently complex, organized around different principles, expressing different possibilities. That different complexity is what we are part of now. Every time a blue whale surfaces in the North Pacific to breathe, every time a humpback sings in water that Megalodon once patrolled, every time a sperm whale descends toward 2,000 meters in an ocean that has not contained a predator capable of threatening it at the surface for 3.6 million years, the ecological legacy of that ancient disappearance is present and active. The ocean remembers its predators in the biology of the animals that outlived them. And the largest predator it has ever held left the deepest memory of all. The cultural weight of Megalodon, the specific character of the fascination it generates across different societies and age groups, is worth examining as a phenomenon in its own right. The interest is not uniform. It clusters around certain features, the size, the teeth, the possibility of continued existence, in ways that reflect specific aspects of the human relationship with large predators. The size fascination connects to a broadly documented human tendency to find extreme scale interesting, independent of any practical relevance. A tendency that explains the appeal of large terrestrial megafauna like elephants and the consistent popularity of large prehistoric animals in public natural history. The tooth fascination connects to the tangibility of the evidence. The fact that a megalodon tooth is an object that can be held in the hand that is physically impressive in a way that most fossil evidence is not. And that connects the holder directly to something real and enormous that existed in the same ocean that still exists. The still alive fascination connects to the broader human tendency to populate the unknown with the things that generate the most awe, a tendency that has produced sea monster legends in cultures across the world and that finds in the deep ocean one of its last credible homes. Understanding why Megalodon generates the fascination it does is not separate from understanding what Megalodon was. The animal and the myth have coexisted for as long as people have been finding the teeth, and the myth has shaped which questions get asked about the animal and which evidence gets attention. The challenge for the science is to maintain the distinction between what is known and what is imagined clearly enough that the mythology does not distort the investigation, while acknowledging that the mythology reflects a genuine and not contemptible response to real evidence of something genuinely extraordinary. The teeth on beaches around the world are real. The animal that made them was real. The ocean that it swam through is the same ocean that is there now. That connection between the real evidence and the real animal and the real ocean is more than enough to justify the fascination. It does not need a mythology to amplify it. The reality is already as strange as anything the mythology has constructed, and it is stranger in the specific ways that matter, the ways that connect to actual biology and actual ecology, and the actual history of the ocean that we are now responsible for understanding and maintaining. The deep time perspective that Megalodon forces on anyone who thinks carefully about it is one of the more disorienting experiences that paleontology offers. 3.6 million years is not a number that human intuition handles well. It is long enough that the landscape, the climate, and the configuration of coastlines have changed significantly. It is long enough that the ancestral lineages of every currently living large mammal species have undergone measurable evolutionary change. It is long enough that the ocean itself has been reorganized by the removal of the apex predator, whose absence created the conditions for that reorganization. And yet, in geological terms, it is recent. The Cambrian explosion of animal life was more than 500 million years ago. The first vertebrates appeared approximately 520 million years ago. The first sharks appeared approximately 450 million years ago. The lineage that gave rise to Megalodon was present in the ocean for tens of millions of years before Megalodon itself evolved. And that lineage had already outlasted multiple mass extinctions and multiple reorganizations of the global ocean before producing the animal whose teeth wash up on beaches today. The 3.6 million years since Megalodon's extinction is a small fraction of the time that its lineage spent in the ocean, and that lineage itself is a small fraction of the time that sharks, as a group, have been in the ocean. The ocean is old in ways that make the entire history of human civilization look like a rounding error. Megalodon is recent by the ocean's standards. The ocean's relationship with time is not our relationship with time, and the history of Megalodon, from its origin to its extinction to the 3.6 million years that have elapsed since, is a history that the ocean has continued through without pause, reorganizing and continuing and producing new forms and losing old ones in the way that it has been doing since before complex life existed. What persists from Megalodon is not the animal itself, but the evidence it left behind and the consequences of its absence. The teeth in the sediment are the evidence. The blue whale swimming in the North Pacific is one consequence. The sperm whale diving to 2,000 meters without fear of surface predation is another. The humpback migrating from the tropics to the poles and back across an ocean that no longer contains a predator capable of threatening it is a third. Every large baleen whale alive today is living in the ecological space that Megalodon's extinction opened, using behavioral strategies and reaching body sizes that Megalodon's presence would have constrained. The largest animals alive are the inheritors of the largest predator's absence. That is the final and most consequential thing that Megalodon left behind. Not the teeth, though the teeth are what survive. Not the mythology, though the mythology is what circulates, the consequence. The ocean, that is, in part, what it is because of what is no longer in it. If this journey moved something in you, consider subscribing to Sleep on Deep. Every week, we descend a little further. The ocean is waiting,